Okay, so this first question is about sampling. The names of all 93 students in a professor's class are written on identical slips of paper, and the slips are placed into a large glass jar. Then the professor selects 14 random slips from the jar. Identify the kind of sample that is being used. Okay, well first let's look at these choices and go through each type and show what's happening there. So cluster sample is I am going to divide here we go. So imagine this is my population here. It's my population. I'm going to divide my population into these groups here. Well, let's do this. Let's do better. Let's say this is my population. I'm going to have these circles represent, not really circles, but you know, close enough. You get what I mean? There's people, there's things, there's whatever we're interested in studying, whatever my population is, there's my population. So what we do is I'm going to divide my population up into these groups. We call them clusters, right? So I divide them up into these groups by some kind of shared attribute or some characteristic or something like that. So I divide my population up into these groups. We call them clusters. Now, from each of these clusters, right? Each of these clusters has some segment of my population in it. So with cluster sampling, I'm going to select maybe one of these clusters. Maybe I'll select this one. Maybe I'll select more than one. You can select one cluster or more than one cluster, right? You select your cluster or clusters, and then you sample every single person or every single entity within that cluster. That's cluster sampling. I select a cluster. Well, I divide my population up into those clusters. Then I select a cluster or clusters and sample every single person in that cluster. That's cluster sampling. Now there's one that's very similar to this. It's not on this list, but it's not one of these choices, but there's another one called stratified sampling. It starts off the same way, right? We have our population. There's my population, right? And I'm going to divide my population up into these groups again, right? Some characteristics, some quality. In this case, they're called stratas. Each of these groups is called a strata, and here each of these groups is called a cluster. So with stratified sampling from each, so I have my groups, right? Now I've got each of my groups, right? So now, get a color here. Now I randomly select, let's say 3 people from each cluster. So each cluster is being used, and I select the same amount from each of these clusters. So let's say I pick 2 people from each cluster. Randomly select 2 people from each cluster. Whatever mechanism I use to randomly select them, we randomly select them. So I divide up into my, sorry, I said clusters, didn't I? I divide into my strata, and I select 2 people from each of these strata, and I sample them. So that's the difference between cluster and stratified, right? Cluster, you choose a whole cluster or whole clusters and sample everyone in those. Stratified, you select the same amount from each of these groups, from each of these strata. Now, simple random sampling is, maybe I should draw that too. Let's say random. I'll use the same kind of circles in a box thing. So there's a lot of different mechanisms to choose random people. You can assign each person a number, a random number, and then use some kind of random number generator to select random numbers. So simple random samplers, I'm just choosing randomly. It's almost like choosing names out of a hat. I don't know. Choose people at random to be sampled. Let's see. Sample of convenience. Convenience. Let me give you an example of that. Let's say this is the mall. There's the door to the mall. And here's the researcher. Here's me. I stand at the door to the mall, and every person that walks by, I give them a survey, or I sample them, or I ask them a question. It's convenient sampling. Whatever's convenient. I stand at the subway station and hand out surveys. I give surveys to my class. Convenience sampling. It's not random, right? It's based on whoever's there at the time. Whoever's convenient, whatever's convenient at the time. Systematic sample. Let's do that. Use the same kind of situation here. Systematic sampling is as it sounds, it's systematic. I'm going to choose every third person and sample them. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Now you want these people to be organized randomly to start, but then you systematically go through and choose every kth person. So in this case, it's 3. So every third person I sample. And those are the major types there. So thinking about this first one, and I took a long time to get to answering this, right? So 93 students' names are placed in a jar or written on a piece of paper, and the slips, right? So those 93 students are all mixed up, jumbled up, and then the professor just picks 14 of them from the jar. Doesn't divide them up into groups, right? So it's not cluster or stratified. Doesn't say I'm choosing every second or third person, so it's not systematic. It's not convenience. It sounds like a simple, random sample.